Level 0, when money is breath itself, it starts with $6 in your account and nothing else. That feels stable. This is not savings. This is not security. This is just the leftover space between survival and collapse. You stare at it like it might change if you look at it long enough. It is 11:47 p.m. and you check your balance again, even though you already know the answer. The number does not move, because numbers like this do not move without something changing in your life first. Still, you check as if repetition might create possibility. Rent has already taken its share before the month even feels real. Bills have already been assigned their place in your future paycheck before you receive it. Everything is already spent in a life where income arrives late and leaves early. There was a $40 subscription you forgot about, and it stayed active long enough to matter. It did not feel like a decision when it happened, only an invisible subtraction. That is how money disappears when you are not watching closely enough. At this level, nothing feels like choice anymore. Every action feels like reaction to something already decided by circumstance. You are not living your financial life, you are responding to it. Food becomes mathematics instead of experience, because every item has a consequence attached to it. You choose based on survival efficiency, not preference or enjoyment. Even waste feels like something you cannot afford emotionally. You begin calculating everything without trying to, as if your mind has adopted it as background processing. If I do this, I lose that, and if I skip this, I survive longer. Thinking becomes survival translation instead of planning. Friends invite you out, but you decline without explanation, because explanation costs more than silence. Over time, they stop asking because patterns are easier to accept than repeated uncertainty. You do not notice the absence at first. The most exhausting part is not being broke. It is never being able to stop thinking about it. Even rest carries calculations in the background of your mind. There is no silence when money is this tight. At zero, money is not a tool or a resource. It is the measure of how long you can continue existing without change, and every day begins and ends inside that measurement. Level 1, when stability is only a shadow. At $500, nothing in your external life changes in a visible way, but internally, something begins to loosen slightly in your chest. The pressure does not disappear, it just stops tightening every second. You still check your balance, but it is no longer pure fear driving the action. It becomes habit instead of panic, repetition instead of urgency. That shift feels small, but changes how you breathe. For the first time, there is silence from your bank account. No overdraft warnings, no immediate penalties, no sudden correction of mistakes. That silence feels unfamiliar enough to be uncomfortable. You begin experimenting with small decisions that were previously impossible. Slightly better food, slightly less restriction, small acts of spending without instant regret. Each one feels like testing reality itself. But stability at this level is fragile and temporary. One unexpected expense can erase everything you built in weeks. You know this because you have lived it before. Still, something changes in how you recover. You do not fall as deep as before, and you do not stay broken as long. Recovery becomes faster than collapse. This is the first time you experience rebuilding instead of restarting. That difference is subtle but foundational. It means you are no longer only surviving loss. At $500, you are not safe in any real sense, but you are no longer completely submerged either. And that in-between state feels like the first surface after drowning. Level 2, when control begins to exist. At $1,000, the number begins to feel intentional instead of accidental. You start realizing it requires maintenance rather than luck. That realization changes how you think about everything. You begin noticing small financial leaks that were invisible before. Not large mistakes, just repeated habits that slowly drain stability. Awareness becomes your first real form of control. You stop reacting instantly to every financial impulse. A small pause begins to appear between thought and action. That pause becomes the beginning of discipline. You still make mistakes, but they no longer reset your entire situation. They adjust your trajectory instead of destroying it. It is a completely different experience. Life becomes less about emergency response and more about pattern recognition. You start understanding that money behaves like behavior over time, not moments, but accumulation. For the first time, you think in cycles instead of isolated events. Lose, adjust, rebuild, repeat becomes your natural rhythm, and rhythm replaces chaos slowly. You begin realizing that survival is not just about avoiding loss. It is about learning how to return from loss without breaking completely. That is a skill, not a condition. At this level, you are still vulnerable, but no longer directionless. You are beginning to participate in your financial life instead of only reacting to it. Level 3, when money starts representing time at $5,000. Something fundamental changes in how you experience daily life. You are no longer constantly resetting to zero after every mistake. There is margin now. That margin changes how you think about time itself. You begin to see weeks instead of just days. Planning enters your mind not as ambition, but as necessity. You notice that small decisions accumulate into visible outcomes over time. What used to feel insignificant now creates patterns you can actually observe. Nothing is isolated anymore. For the first time, you stop calculating every single purchase in real time. Not because you are careless, but because you are stable enough to delay reaction. That delay is freedom in its smallest form. You begin understanding that money is not just about earning or spending. It is about how long you can maintain direction without interruption, and that changes everything. You still face setbacks, but they are no longer catastrophic. They slow progress instead of erasing it completely. That distinction builds confidence quietly. You start noticing that stability is not a moment, it is repetition. It is not something you reach, it is something you maintain continuously. That realization becomes important. At $5,000, life is still uncertain, but uncertainty is no longer the only thing defining it. Level 4, when thinking starts to expand at $10,000, your thinking begins to extend beyond immediate survival. You start seeing patterns across months instead of isolated weeks. Time becomes a tool instead of pressure. You begin understanding that consistency matters more than intensity. One strong decision is less powerful than repeated ordinary discipline. That realization slowly restructures your behavior. Small returns begin appearing without direct effort. Not enough to change life, but enough to change perception. Money begins to show signs of self-movement. You start realizing patience is not passive. It is active resistance against impulsive correction. Holding becomes a skill instead of waiting. You begin separating emotional reactions from financial decisions. Not perfectly, but increasingly. That separation reduces instability significantly. There are moments where you feel discomfort watching money fluctuate, but you resist reacting immediately, and that resistance becomes strength over time. You begin understanding that growth is not sudden. It is accumulation over long periods of consistent behavior. That understanding shifts your expectations permanently. At $10,000, you are no longer only reacting to money. You are learning how to shape it. Level 5, when income is no longer the only path. At $25,000, You begin questioning the structure of income itself. You notice that time limits your earning potential more than effort does. That realization changes direction. You start experimenting with alternatives outside your main income. Small projects, side efforts, attempts at additional value creation. Not out of dissatisfaction, but curiosity. Some experiments fail completely. Some produce small returns that feel unexpectedly meaningful. The outcome is not the point, the possibility is. You begin noticing that financial growth is no longer purely linear. It becomes layered, involving multiple inputs instead of one source. That complexity changes your thinking. You stop identifying your financial position only through salary. You begin considering systems, not just income streams. That shift is subtle but important. Your decisions become more intentional because consequences now extend beyond immediate impact. You begin thinking in allocation rather than consumption. At this stage, money is no longer just survival or stability. It becomes structure that can be redesigned. Level 6. When you stop thinking like you are broke at $50,000, your behavior begins to change significantly, even if your lifestyle does not. You stop reacting emotionally to every expense. Decisions become more deliberate. You begin saying no more often without guilt. Not because you are restricting yourself, but because you are aware of trade-offs. Awareness replaces fear. You start understanding that not every opportunity is worth participation. Some costs are invisible but still real. That realization changes your boundaries. Social pressure loses influence gradually. You no longer confuse spending with belonging or participation. That separation strengthens discipline. You begin thinking in terms of structure instead of reaction. Money becomes something you organize rather than something you chase. Even setbacks feel different now. They are adjustments, not resets. That distinction stabilizes your mindset significantly. At this level, money is no longer emotional chaos. It becomes manageable structure. Level 7. When money starts multiplying without effort. At $100,000, external perception changes before internal identity catches up. People assume stability, competence, and knowledge based only on numbers. You begin encountering systems that treat you differently without explanation. Opportunities, conversations, expectations all shift subtly. You notice it even if you do not announce it. Risk becomes more meaningful because loss is now absolute, not relative. That changes how carefully you think before acting. You begin understanding allocation as a skill that determines outcomes more than income itself. Where money goes matters more than how it arrives. Your decisions become slower but more deliberate. Impulse loses influence over time. Structure gains importance. At this stage, money is no longer something you earn. It is something you manage continuously. Level 8. When money becomes structure at $1 million, the emotional relationship with money begins to disappear. Not because it becomes meaningless, but because it becomes structural instead of personal. You begin operating through systems rather than direct effort. Taxes, planning, allocation, protection all become part of your environment. Simplicity is gone permanently. Problems are no longer about survival. They're about optimization and structure. That shift changes the nature of thinking entirely. You realize money does not change identity. It reveals the structure of decisions that built it. That realization is irreversible. Life becomes less reactive and more designed. Every decision fits into a larger system instead of immediate needs. At this level, money stops being a goal. It becomes a framework. Level 9. When scale replaces personality at $10 million, money no longer behaves like something you personally control. It behaves like a system with its own momentum and direction. Decisions are no longer individual actions but structural influences. The gap between cause and effect becomes wider and less emotional. You begin thinking in terms of reach instead of accumulation. Impact replaces ownership as the primary measurement. Relationships with money become indirect. Systems, teams, and structures mediate everything. Simplicity is no longer accessible. You begin realizing wealth is not about possession. It is about the scale of influence your decisions create. And influence changes responsibility permanently. Final realization: what never changes somewhere right now. Someone is checking a balance that feels too small to survive on. They are making silent calculations that no one sees. They believe this moment defines everything. It does not define everything. It defines direction. Every level of money is not a different life. It is a different version of the same process expanding over time. Behavior becomes identity, and identity becomes outcome. Money does not transform people instantly. It compounds what they repeat consistently. That is the only rule that never changes. The number always starts small, because everything large is built from something that once felt insignificant. And most people never recognize that what they are looking at is not their limit. It is their beginning.